Modern agriculture didn't choose the best crops. It chose the easiest ones to control. There's an entire class of native foods, plants that fed civilizations for thousands of years, that were quietly abandoned. Not because they failed, because they worked too well. They required no fertilizer, no irrigation, no replanting. And that made them worthless to an industry built on selling seeds, chemicals, and equipment. What you're about to learn isn't theory. It's a blueprint that indigenous farmers perfected over millennia and that industrial agriculture buried. Let's start. Tepary beans, the first one most people have never heard of, is the tepary bean. This small, unassuming legume was cultivated by the Tohono O'odham people in the Sonoran Desert for thousands of years, one of the most brutal growing environments on the planet. Average rainfall, 3 inches per year, temperatures exceeding 118 degrees Fahrenheit, and the tepary bean thrives there. This is what researchers now call the most drought-adapted bean species in the world. It can germinate, mature, and produce a full harvest using only the moisture from a single monsoon rain. No irrigation system, no careful watering schedule. Plant it when the soil is wet, and 60 days later you have food. But here's why it disappeared from most tables. Tepary beans don't need much water, which means they don't fit into the irrigation-dependent systems that modern agriculture is built around. When mechanized irrigation became standard in the early 20th century, farmers shifted to crops that could absorb all that water. Tepary beans actually perform worse with too much moisture. They're adapted to scarcity, not abundance. So a bean that could feed people in conditions where nothing else survives was replaced by crops that demanded constant inputs. What makes this relevant now is climate change. As water becomes scarcer across the American Southwest and beyond, researchers are returning to tepary beans with fresh eyes. They've discovered the bean is not only drought-tolerant, but also heat-tolerant, capable of setting fruit at temperatures that would destroy common bean varieties. And nutritionally, tepary beans are exceptional, high in soluble fiber, rich in protein, with a low glycemic index that makes them valuable for managing blood sugar. For home growers, tepary beans represent something rare, a food crop that actually prefers neglect. They don't want your attention. They don't want your fertilizer. They want to be left alone in poor soil with minimal water. And in exchange, they'll produce a harvest year after year. The knowledge to grow these beans never disappeared entirely. Seed banks like Native Seeds/Search in Tucson still distribute them. But the industrial food system has no incentive to promote a crop that requires almost nothing to grow. There's something else worth understanding. The Tohono O'odham people who cultivated tepary beans for millennia didn't just stumble onto a good plant. They developed sophisticated techniques for desert agriculture that researchers are still studying today. They planted in areas where summer monsoon rains would naturally flood, timing their sowing to catch that brief window of soil moisture. They managed water flow with light dams and channels. They selected for varieties that could complete their entire life cycle in 60 days before the desert dried out again. This wasn't primitive farming waiting to be improved by modern technology. This was precision agriculture, adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth. And when you grow tepary beans today, you're inheriting thousands of years of selective breeding that optimize this plant for conditions that are becoming more common everywhere. The sleeping crops of the eastern woodlands, another powerful one, is what archaeologists now call the sleeping crops of eastern North America. Before corn arrived from Mexico, indigenous farmers across the Mississippi Valley and Great Lakes region cultivated an entirely different agricultural system, one that modern science is only beginning to understand. These crops have names that sound like weeds: goosefoot, sumpweed, maygrass, erect knotweed, little barley. And that's exactly what happened to them. When corn agriculture spread northward, these native grains were gradually abandoned. The domesticated varieties went extinct. The plants reverted to their wild forms. And for centuries, they were dismissed as worthless weeds. But archaeological evidence tells a different story. These crops were cultivated for over 3,000 years. Farmers selectively bred them for larger seeds and thinner seed coats, the same domestication markers we see in wheat and rice. At sites in Illinois and Kentucky, researchers have found seed caches that prove these weren't just foraged plants. They were crops, with established varieties and sophisticated growing practices. What made them efficient was their timing. Maygrass ripened in spring, goosefoot matured in summer, knotweed was ready in fall. Together they created a continuous food supply, no single planting season, no single vulnerable harvest window. And unlike corn, which depletes soil nitrogen, these crops actually improve the land. Goosefoot, a relative of quinoa, is remarkably nutrient-dense and grows vigorously in disturbed soil. Recent experiments at Washington University have shown that when goosefoot and knotweed are grown together as a polyculture, they outperform either crop grown alone. The combined yield rivals that of traditional corn agriculture. These weren't primitive experiments before real farming arrived. They were a complete, functional food system that worked with the land instead of against it. Why does this matter for gardeners today? Because the wild relatives of these crops still exist. Researchers are collecting seeds and creating cultivation guides. The sleeping crops aren't lost, they're waiting. And they're adapted to conditions that modern crops struggle with, including the increasingly wet and flood-prone soils of the Midwest. Here's something most people don't realize. The term sleeping crops was suggested by members of the St. Louis Native American Women's Care Circle. They pointed out that calling them lost crops had a colonial tone, implying that indigenous cultures and knowledge were extinct. But the crops aren't lost. The knowledge isn't gone. It's sleeping, waiting for people to pick up their side of the relationship and plant them again. Archaeologist Natalie Mueller at Washington University maintains a seed bank of these species and distributes seeds to educational institutions and indigenous farmers. Her research has shown that sumpweed, knotweed, and goosefoot evolved specifically to thrive in floodplain conditions, the exact environments that are becoming more common as climate patterns shift. While corn and soybeans struggle in waterlogged soil, these sleeping crops were literally designed for it. Cultivation experiments have revealed something else. These crops don't need the careful attention that most garden vegetables require. Goosefoot, the same plant you've probably pulled from your garden as a weed, produces nutritious seeds and edible leaves with almost no intervention. It's the North American relative of quinoa, with similar nutritional value and far more resilience to local growing conditions. Jerusalem artichoke. One of the most overlooked is the Jerusalem artichoke, also called sunchoke. This native sunflower species was cultivated by indigenous peoples across eastern North America long before European contact. Samuel de Champlain encountered Native Americans growing them at Cape Cod in 1605 and noted that the tubers tasted like artichokes, which is how they got their misleading name. The efficiency of Jerusalem artichokes is almost absurd. Plant a few tubers in spring, and by fall, you'll have dozens more. Each plant can produce 75 to 200 tubers in a single season. The yield per acre rivals potatoes, 7 to 9 tons of tubers, plus substantial above-ground biomass. And unlike potatoes, Jerusalem artichokes are perennial. Leave some tubers in the ground and they'll come back next year. No replanting required. They're also extraordinarily hardy. The tubers can survive temperatures as low as -30 degrees Fahrenheit while dormant underground. They tolerate poor soil. They're virtually pest-free. They don't need fertilizer because they're not demanding nitrogen from the soil the way annual crops do. This is precisely why modern agriculture ignored them. Jerusalem artichokes don't fit the model. You can't sell new seed stock every year if the crop replants itself. You can't sell pesticides if there are no pests. You can't sell fertilizer if the plant doesn't need it. The entire economic structure of industrial agriculture depends on crops that require continuous inputs. A self-perpetuating food source has no place in that system. There's another layer to this story. Jerusalem artichoke tubers store their carbohydrates as inulin rather than starch. This makes them valuable for diabetics and anyone managing blood sugar. Inulin doesn't spike glucose the way potato starch does. The tubers are also prebiotic, feeding beneficial gut bacteria in ways that support digestive health. For home growers, the main challenge with Jerusalem artichokes is containing them. They spread aggressively and can become invasive if you're not careful. But that problem is actually a feature in the right context. Plant them in a dedicated patch or along a fence line, and you'll have a permanent food supply that requires almost no work. Harvest what you need in late fall after the first frost. The cold converts some of the inulin to fructose, making the tubers sweeter, and leave the rest to regenerate. The colonists who first encountered this plant were so impressed that they shipped tubers back to Europe, where Jerusalem artichokes briefly became a fashionable food among the wealthy. Then they fell out of favor, partly because of their association with famine foods during wartime and partly because industrial agriculture had no use for them. There's an Iroquois story that the first sunchokes grew from the feet of Earth Woman after she died, giving birth to her twin sons. The plant has been intertwined with indigenous culture and sustenance for as long as anyone can remember. Early European accounts consistently describe Native Americans cultivating these tubers and trading them widely. The name Jerusalem artichoke is a linguistic accident. Italian settlers called the plant girasole, the Italian word for sunflower, because it's in the sunflower family. English speakers corrupted girasole into Jerusalem. The artichoke part came from Samuel de Champlain, who thought the tubers tasted similar to artichokes. So the name is doubly wrong. It's neither from Jerusalem nor related to artichokes. Some modern growers prefer the name sunchoke, which at least acknowledges the plant's sunflower heritage. What makes Jerusalem artichokes particularly valuable is their biomass production. The above-ground growth can exceed 10 feet tall, producing dense stands of material that can be used for mulch, animal bedding, or composting. Some researchers have studied sunchokes as a biofuel feedstock because of their high yields and low input requirements. You're not just growing a food crop, you're growing a soil-building system that happens to produce food. If you're looking for a food crop that pays dividends year after year with minimal effort, this is it. American groundnut, another one that history nearly forgot, is the American groundnut, known by its indigenous name Hopnus. This perennial vine is native to eastern North America, ranging from Canada to Florida, and it produces both edible tubers and edible beans, making it one of the only plants that offers two distinct protein sources from a single species. The groundnut's role in American history is difficult to overstate. This was the plant that helped the Pilgrims survive their first years in Massachusetts. When their crops failed and rations ran low, they learned from the local Wampanoag people to harvest groundnut tubers from the wild. The plant literally made European settlement possible, and then was promptly forgotten once settlers established conventional farms. What makes groundnut remarkable is its nutritional profile. The tubers contain roughly 3 times the protein of potatoes. They're also a good source of calcium, iron, and other minerals. And because groundnut is a legume, it fixes nitrogen in the soil, improving fertility rather than depleting it. The tubers grow in a distinctive pattern, like beads on a string along underground runners. This makes them somewhat challenging to harvest commercially, which is one reason they never caught on as a mainstream crop. The other reason is time. Groundnut takes 2 to 3 years to reach maximum yield. In a food system built on annual returns, a crop that asks you to wait is a crop that gets ignored. But for home growers thinking long-term, this is an asset. Plant groundnut once, and you've established a permanent food source. The vines will climb any available support, corn stalks, sunflowers, trellises, reaching 6 feet or more. They produce fragrant purple-brown flowers that attract pollinators. And year after year, the root system expands, producing more tubers than the year before. Louisiana State University ran a breeding program for decades, selecting for larger tuber size and higher yields. Some of those improved varieties are still available from specialty nurseries. The only place in the world where groundnut is currently grown as a commercial crop is Japan, where it's known as hadoimo and valued as a traditional food. The flavor is often compared to roasted sweet potatoes with a nuttier finish. The tubers can be boiled, roasted, mashed, or dried and ground into flour. If you're building a perennial food system that provides calories and protein without annual replanting, groundnut belongs in your plan. One thing to understand about groundnut is that it represents a path not taken in agricultural history. When European colonists arrived, they had a choice. They could learn indigenous food systems and work with plants adapted to the land, or they could impose European agriculture, wheat, barley, cattle, pigs, onto a landscape that wasn't designed for it. We know which path they chose, and groundnut, along with dozens of other native foods, was pushed aside. The Cree people were observed cultivating groundnut before European contact. The Lenape relied on the tubers as a regular food source. Virtually every indigenous group in eastern North America knew and used this plant, yet it never became a commercial crop. Part of the reason is patience. Industrial agriculture optimizes for immediate returns. Groundnut asks you to wait 2 or 3 years for maximum yield. In a system where farmers are constantly managing debt and cash flow, a crop that doesn't produce quickly is a crop that doesn't get planted. But for home growers, that waiting period is an investment, not a cost. The root system expands each year. The vines climb higher and produce more. By year 3 or 4, you're harvesting from a well-established system that will continue producing with minimal attention. Pawpaw, the next one, has been called America's forgotten fruit, and that name barely captures the strangeness of its story. The pawpaw is the largest edible fruit native to North America, bigger than any berry, any apple, any plum that grows wild on this continent. And almost no one knows it exists. The first written record of pawpaws comes from the De Soto expedition in 1541, which found Native Americans cultivating the trees east of the Mississippi. The fruit was so valued that its range today, extending from the Gulf Coast up to southern Ontario, is partly the result of indigenous cultivation over centuries. People carried pawpaw seeds northward and planted them deliberately. Thomas Jefferson grew pawpaws at Monticello. George Washington considered them his favorite dessert fruit. The Lewis and Clark expedition survived on pawpaws when their food supplies ran low. This wasn't an obscure curiosity. This was a widely known, widely loved fruit that somehow vanished from American consciousness. The reason is straightforward: pawpaws don't ship. The fruit is soft, custard-like, and extremely perishable. Once ripe, it lasts only a few days at room temperature before spoiling. It bruises easily. It can't be harvested green and ripened later the way bananas can. In a food system built around long-distance transportation and extended shelf life, the pawpaw was simply incompatible. So while apples and peaches, fruits that can survive weeks in cold storage, became commercial staples, the pawpaw was relegated to foragers and hobbyists. It never disappeared entirely, but it faded from mainstream awareness to the point where most Americans have never tasted one. What makes pawpaw efficient isn't yield or ease of cultivation, it's ecological fit. Pawpaw trees are native understory plants, meaning they grow naturally in the shade of larger trees. They don't need full sun. They don't need cleared fields. They can produce fruit in spaces where most fruit trees would fail. And because they spread through root suckers, a single planting can eventually become a self-sustaining patch that fruits indefinitely. The flavor is unlike anything else in temperate North America, often described as a cross between banana, mango, and pineapple. This is because pawpaw is the only temperate member of a tropical fruit family that includes cherimoya and soursop. It's a tropical taste from a cold, hardy tree. For home growers, the key is understanding that pawpaw requires cross-pollination. You need at least two genetically distinct trees to get fruit. The flowers are pollinated by flies and beetles attracted to their slightly fetid smell, not bees, so fruit set can be variable. Once established, a pawpaw patch is remarkably self-sufficient. The trees tolerate wet soil, resist most pests, and provide food for wildlife alongside human harvests. Named varieties with larger fruit and better flavor are now available from specialty nurseries. If you have a shady corner of your property that seems unsuitable for food production, pawpaw might be exactly what belongs there. There's a cultural dimension to the pawpaw story that matters. This fruit was a lifeline for people on the margins, not just the pilgrims, but generations of travelers, settlers, and enslaved people escaping northward. The pawpaw fruited reliably, grew in places other trees couldn't, and provided calories when other food sources were scarce. It was, in a real sense, a freedom fruit. The decline of pawpaw tracks closely with the industrialization of American food. When railroads and refrigeration made it possible to ship apples from Washington State to New York City, local fruits that couldn't travel became irrelevant to the commercial system. Pawpaw didn't disappear because people stopped loving it. It disappeared because it couldn't participate in a nationwide distribution network. What's happening now is a quiet renaissance. Pawpaw festivals have emerged in Ohio, Kentucky, and other states. Kentucky State University runs a dedicated research program breeding improved varieties. Small-scale growers are finding markets at farmers' markets and local restaurants that value unique regional foods. Zebra swallowtail butterfly, Tennessee state butterfly, uses pawpaw as its exclusive larval host plant. When you plant pawpaw, you're not just growing food. You're creating habitat for a native species that can't survive without this specific tree. That's the kind of efficiency that industrial agriculture can't measure, but that actually matters. Wild rice. Another one that deserves attention is wild rice, the only grain native to North America. This isn't the black paddy-grown rice you see in supermarkets. True wild rice is a different thing entirely. A sacred food of the Ojibwe people, harvested by canoe from shallow lakes and rivers using wooden poles called knockers, then dried over hardwood fires. The Ojibwe call it manumin, meaning good berry, and their migration story describes traveling westward until they found the place where food grows on water. Wild rice has been central to their culture, spirituality, and sustenance for at least 12,000 years. What makes wild rice efficient in ways modern agriculture can't replicate is its integration with the ecosystem. Wild rice doesn't just grow in lakes, it creates habitat. The tall reed stands provide cover for waterfowl, fish, and countless other species. The grain feeds ducks and geese. The roots stabilize sediment. The entire system is self-perpetuating. Harvesting by traditional methods leaves enough grain to reseed the lake naturally, while dropped seeds ensure next year's crop. Compare this to industrial rice paddies, which require leveling land, controlling water flow, applying fertilizers, and replanting each year. Wild rice asks for none of that. It simply grows where the conditions are right. The challenge is that true wild rice refuses to be domesticated in the conventional sense. It won't grow in paddies. It requires flowing water at specific depths, specific soil composition, specific climate conditions. The University of Minnesota developed cultivated varieties in the 1960s that can be grown in paddies and harvested by combine. But the Ojibwe and other indigenous harvesters point out that this is a completely different product. Paddy-grown rice is tough, takes twice as long to cook, and lacks the nuanced flavor of lake-harvested manumin. For most home growers, cultivating true wild rice isn't practical unless you have a pond or wetland area. But the larger lesson is important. Some foods are efficient precisely because they can't be scaled up and industrialized. Their efficiency is local, ecological, relationship-based. and that makes them invisible to a system that measures value only in tons per acre. If you can source authentic hand-harvested wild rice from Native American producers, you're supporting both a sustainable food system and indigenous food sovereignty. The White Earth Nation in Minnesota and other tribal communities sell their harvests directly. The difference between true wild rice and paddy-grown rice isn't subtle. Real manoomin, harvested from lakes and finished over hardwood fires, has a delicate tea-like flavor and a texture that curls into loose ringlets when cooked. It's ready in 25 to 30 minutes. Paddy rice is tough, almost unchewable even after an hour of cooking, with a flat, generic taste. And here's something most people don't know. The University of Minnesota's efforts to commercialize wild rice through paddy cultivation created a genuine threat to native wild rice populations. Cross-pollination between cultivated varieties and wild plants could contaminate the genetic heritage that indigenous communities have stewarded for millennia. The very thing that made wild rice valuable, its wildness, is endangered by attempts to tame it. The Ojibwe have fought to protect manoomin legally and culturally. In some cases, they've worked to establish wild rice as having legal rights of its own, part of a broader movement recognizing the rights of nature. This isn't about nostalgia. It's about recognizing that some food systems are valuable precisely because they can't be industrialized. For most of us, the practical lesson is about sourcing. Know where your wild rice comes from. Understand the difference between supporting indigenous food sovereignty and buying a commodity product that undermines it. And recognize that efficiency in the deepest sense includes relationships between people and plants, between harvester and ecosystem. American hazelnut, the next one, fills a gap that most food systems ignore entirely. Perennial nut production adapted to eastern North America. The American hazelnut is native from Louisiana to Manitoba, thriving in conditions where European hazelnuts would succumb to disease. And yet almost no one grows them. The reason is familiar by now. American hazelnuts are smaller than their European cousins and slightly more difficult to shell. When agricultural researchers looked at which hazelnut species to develop commercially, they chose the European varieties for their larger nuts and easier processing, even though those varieties struggle with Eastern filbert blight, a fungal disease endemic to North America. The result is that virtually all hazelnuts sold in America come from Oregon or Turkey, shipped thousands of miles, while a native species that could produce locally remains on the margins. But here's what makes American hazelnuts efficient in ways that European varieties are not. They require no pesticides or fungicides because they've co-evolved with local diseases and pests. They start bearing nuts in as little as 4 years. They tolerate a wide range of soil conditions, including partial shade, and they can produce for 40 years or longer once established. Hazelnuts can yield more protein and more vegetable oil per acre than corn or soybeans. Unlike those annual crops, they don't require annual planting, tillage, or massive fertilizer inputs. A hazelnut planting is essentially a permanent food infrastructure that improves with age. Recent breeding efforts have crossed American hazelnuts with European varieties to create hybrids that combine blight resistance with larger nut size. Organizations like the Arbor Day Foundation and the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative are working to establish hazelnut as a viable commercial crop in regions where it's never been grown at scale. For home growers, hazelnuts offer multiple yields. The nuts themselves are rich in healthy fats and protein. The dense, multi-stemmed growth provides excellent habitat for wildlife and can serve as a windbreak or privacy screen. The wood, when coppiced, produces straight poles perfect for garden stakes, trellises, and even furniture making. This is what permaculture practitioners mean when they talk about stacking functions, a single planting that yields food, materials, wildlife habitat, and land improvement simultaneously. Hazelnuts do all of this with minimal ongoing input. Consider the economics. A hazelnut planting requires an upfront investment of time and a few dollars for plants. After 4 to 7 years, you begin harvesting. After 10 years, you're getting substantial yields. And this continues for decades, 40 years, sometimes longer. Compare that to annual nut crops like peanuts, which require tillage, planting, harvesting, and replanting every single year, along with all the inputs those operations demand. The American hazelnut is also one of the few nut trees that tolerates juglone, the natural herbicide produced by black walnuts. This means you can plant hazelnuts as an understory beneath walnuts or butternut trees, creating a layered system that produces two different nut crops from the same space. There's another angle worth considering. Almost all hazelnuts consumed in North America are imported from Turkey or grown in Oregon. Supply chains are fragile, prices fluctuate, and filbert blight is now spreading in Oregon, threatening the commercial industry there. Meanwhile, a disease-resistant native species grows, wild across half the continent and is barely cultivated. This is what dependency looks like. We import a crop we could grow locally because the native version wasn't optimized for industrial production. We build supply chains spanning oceans when the alternative is literally growing in our hedgerows. Planting American hazelnuts isn't just about food production. It's about resilience, reducing your dependence on systems you can't control. The Three Sisters system, one of the most powerful examples, isn't a single crop but a planting method. The Three Sisters system used by indigenous peoples across North America. Corn, beans, and squash grown together in the same mound. It sounds simple. It's actually sophisticated agriculture refined over thousands of years. The corn provides a vertical structure for beans. To climb, the beans fix nitrogen in the soil, feeding the corn. The squash spreads broad leaves across the ground, shading out weeds and retaining moisture. Each plant supports the others. Together, they yield more food per acre than any of them grown alone. Modern agricultural science has recently confirmed what indigenous farmers knew empirically for centuries. Research by agronomist Jane M.T. Pleasant at Cornell showed that Three Sisters polyculture produces both more energy and more protein per hectare than monocultures of the same crops. The system isn't just culturally significant, it's measurably more productive. And there's a nutritional dimension as well. Corn, beans, and squash together provide all 9 essential amino acids. They form a complete protein when eaten together, which is why this combination formed the dietary foundation of so many indigenous nations. The Three Sisters aren't just efficient to grow, they're efficient to eat. Why didn't industrial agriculture adopt this system? Because it can't be mechanized. You can't run a combine through a mound of interplanted crops. You can't apply a single herbicide when 3 different species are growing together. The efficiency of the Three Sisters is human-scale, attention-based, relational. It requires understanding how the plants interact and adjusting your approach accordingly. For home gardeners, this is actually an advantage. You don't need machines, you don't need chemicals, you need observation and care. And in exchange, you get a complete food system from a single planting bed. The Iroquois didn't just grow these 3 crops together, they understood them as spiritual beings. The Three Sisters were depicted as inseparable companions, each essential to the other's survival. Agricultural knowledge and spiritual meaning were intertwined. When you plant a Three Sisters garden, you're participating in a tradition that carried meaning far beyond calories and yield. There's a practical lesson here for modern growers. The specific varieties matter. A Three Sisters planting works best with tall corn varieties that provide adequate climbing structure, vigorous pole beans that don't overwhelm the corn, and sprawling winter squash that shade the ground effectively. Some modern hybrid corn varieties are too short. Some bean varieties are too aggressive. The system works when the components are matched. Many seed companies now offer Three Sisters seed collections specifically selected to work together. These typically include flour corn or dent corn, not the sweet corn most gardeners grow, climbing beans like scarlet runner or pole varieties, and traditional winter squash like butternut or Hubbard. The timing matters too. Indigenous farmers planted corn first, waiting until it reached knee height before adding beans. Squash went in last, around the edges of the mounds. This sequencing prevents the beans from overwhelming young corn and gives the squash room to spread without shading out seedlings. If you're someone who finds value in content like this, people who want to grow smarter, not just grow more, consider subscribing. This channel is built for people who think independently and want real knowledge, not hype. Building your system, here's what all of these crops have in common. They work on long time horizons. They improve conditions rather than depleting them. They reduce dependency on external inputs, and they were systematically excluded from industrial food production, precisely because those qualities made them useless for selling seeds, fertilizers, pesticides, and equipment. The crops that dominate modern agriculture aren't dominant because they're best for growers or eaters. They're dominant because they're best for selling. Annual crops that require replanting every year mean annual seed purchases. Crops that deplete soil mean fertilizer sales. Crops vulnerable to pests mean pesticide sales. The system selects for dependency, not efficiency. Think about this carefully. The market incentive is toward dependency, not self-sufficiency. A seed company makes more money selling you seeds every year than selling you seeds once. A chemical company makes more money if your crops require their products. The entire economic structure doesn't reward resilience, it actively selects against it. Indigenous agricultural systems were built on the opposite logic: perennial crops, seed-saving traditions, polycultures that improved soil fertility. Knowledge passed through generations rather than purchased annually. The efficiency wasn't measured in profit per acre, it was measured in how well the system sustained people over time, with minimal external inputs. We're living through a moment when those values are becoming relevant again. Water is scarce and getting scarcer. Climate patterns are shifting. Supply chains that seemed permanent are breaking. The question of how to produce food without constant dependency on purchased inputs isn't academic anymore. The native foods we've discussed here represent a different logic. Tepary beans that thrive on neglect, groundnuts that provide protein for decades from a single planting, pawpaws that produce fruit in the shade, Jerusalem artichokes that spread faster than you can eat them, wild rice that feeds an entire ecosystem while feeding you. These aren't alternatives to consider eventually. They're strategies for right now, for anyone who wants a food supply that becomes more secure over time rather than more expensive. If you leave a comment about which of these crops you're planning to try, you'll be joining a community of people who think differently about growing. Drop a like if this changed how you think about food production. And if you know someone who's frustrated with the expense and fragility of conventional gardening, share this with them.